Computer. Thank you for joining in with us for our talk with Sophia Moreau. We apologize for the delay. As usual, we had some technical difficulties, but today we are here to have an international conversation. This is our Black History Month talk out of the Black Studies Department. I'm Dr. David Childs. Many of you know me, some don't. Um, this is a part of something we do with Black Studies every year. We have a speaker or two throughout um, Black History Month. We've been really trying to expand our conversations for the students, for the community, for faculty and staff. And Miss Moreau was originally going to come in person, but just through various circumstances, and I don't blame her. The climate is kind of hostile here in the United States. Um, she was not able to come in person, but she plans to in the near future and sometime in the future to make a visit, and we'll let everybody know. But she agreed to do this online. Um, so here we are, Northern Kentucky University. We're honored to host Sophia Moreau, an international scholar. I'm just going to say a few words here about her background, and then from there we will get into our talk. Okay. Um, Sophia Moreau is from the UK. In fact, she's in the United Kingdom right now. There, I believe it's like 9:30, and so she's very generously is up kind of late for us. It's only 4:30. But she's a multi-award winning leader in DEI, compliance, social impact, and governance, building ethical, inclusive, and high impact organizations. She's a trainer, speaker, auditor, investigator, and she does this work in the UK. She's done a couple talks for a wonderful group out of DC, a podcast and media company called Media and Society. In fact, that's where what I first heard her talk and do work around cross cultural DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I like to say the whole word. And she was doing phenomenal work. And I thought, wow, we got to try to figure out how to get her at NKU. She's an experienced senior leader, expert consultant, public speaker, featured on several news and television networks in the UK: Sky News, Channel 4, The Guardian, HR Magazine, BBC World Service, Woman's Hour, Radio 5. She does alongside regular engagements as a keynote speaker and press spokesperson. She regularly produces written content for news publications, blogs, academic literature. Notably, she's a recipient of the Hemsworth Scholarship from the Middle Temple. Speaking engagements and guest lectures include the United Nations, Wrigley's Employment Law and Governance Conference, Albright, Charity Times, London Funders, University of Chester. She's studied law at the University of London, and we're just happy to have her on and on and on. You can check out her LinkedIn page and see all of the wonderful work that she does. We also have Dr. Eric Jackson. He's a renowned scholar, author. Dr. Jackson is going to join us at the end of the program. At the end of her talk, we're going to do a panel. He's going to lead a panel discussion. But Dr. Jackson is actually. Let me have these folks just show your face since I'm introducing you. Let me just temporarily here and here are the wonderful faces. Dr. Jackson here is the Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Science at Northern Kentucky University. And I'm not kidding, one of the renowned world experts in Black studies. We always joke when we say somebody wrote the book. Dr. Jackson actually did write the quintessential book on Black studies. He noticed that there was not any work, seminal work around Black studies in a really long time. So he wrote the book. And he's written 3-4 other books around education. He's a Fulbright scholar, books around education, Black studies, African American history. A wonderful teacher, well thought of by the students. Many articles, full professor. What can I say? It's a great guy. He's done so much work. Every time I ask him, and it's always last minute, he comes and does it, and he's so busy. And he does a really cool underground railroad tour around the city, Kentucky and Ohio, and so we've been working together on that. So, without further ado, these are distinguished speakers. I want everybody to just put your hands together. Now, what I want to ask the audience to do is, I want to give you two things to do. Please, as Miss Moreau is speaking, and when you hear the panel discussion, put questions in the chat and in the post or comments, because we're going to do our best to share questions at the end of the talk and the panel discussion. And also, if you could tweet things out, or not tweet, don't use Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, LinkedIn, share this conversation. If you have quotes and that you want, use hashtag Dr. David Childs or hashtag NKU. Share quotes, thoughts, comments you might have. That's kind of your homework. You can. I always tell people to email me as well, childsd1@nku.edu. I put these things in the chat. I know I'm talking kind of fast because I'm trying to make up for lost time. Okay, without further ado, we're going to go dark, and we're going to have Miss Moreau share. I might need to give you. You have permission now. You can share your screen if you need to, Miss Moreau. Without further ado, we're going to hear from you. Thank you so much for speaking to us from the United Kingdom.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here. I'm honored to be joining the Black Studies Department and in such esteemed company as well. So it's a great opportunity for the introductions too. I hope you're all able to see my slides. Now, I appreciate that we're in webinar format for today, so I would really love it if you could please introduce your name in the chat, your role, where you're dialing in from today. This would be fantastic. So over the next just under probably half an hour to 40 minutes or so, I'm conscious of time and I want to give us time for interaction. I'm going to be covering a little bit of diversity, equity, and inclusion from a UK lens. I'm doing a bit of transatlantic comparison. Now, I thought it might be helpful to do some introduction on my end. Thank you for the very generous introduction, Dr. David. So I've been working in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space since around 2011. And that was 1 year after the introduction of the UK Equality Act, which I'll be covering later on in this talk today. Now, I trained in journalism at the Stephen Lawrence Charitable Trust, and Stephen Lawrence was a young man who was murdered in racist violence in the 1990s, and what his family experienced in the years since was institutional racism on the hands of the police. And the incredible family ended up launching charity, as well as, for example, training for architects, which was the profession that that 17-year-old, 18-year-old was about to go into had he been able to live, as well as journalism training, because there was such racist coverage at the material time. So I was trained by this organization and I went into freelance journalism, and I was really interested in the conversation around inequalities. So this would have been around the mid 2010s. Then I ended up going into external facing campaigns and change making and influencing. So I was really looking more so at changing the dial and furthering progress. Um, then I realized that I'm looking at changing the culture, but there isn't even basic legal compliance happening. So I then ran anti-discrimination clinics and advice and support since around 2018. So this was for charities such as Pregnant Then Screwed, an anti-maternity discrimination legal charity and campaign group, as well as later on a legal tech for good company called Valor. I then went on to write a guide on how to diversify your board, because I ended up going into boards and often reporting to them as I went into the leadership of organizations. And I realized about the extreme diversity deficit that existed at board level. Later on, I went into launching DEI consultancy. So that was around 2021, but I still kept a hand in trying to be part of that change. So I became the deputy leader of the Women's Equality Party in around 2023 until the tail end of 2024. So that's a bit of a really brief journey. Outside of that, I was born in the United Kingdom, so I'm very much a South London, Croydon person. which I now reside in again, which is fantastic. My daughter is half American. I lived there for a while when I was younger in New York City, which I do regularly visit still. So I've always had an eye on the transatlantic side of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and often how our environments will inform and interact with one another. So, what we're going to be covering today, bearing in mind that we do have less than an hour together, so I thought we'd look a little bit at the foundations, and we'd look at the role of education, the Equality Act 2010, so the law, and diversity, equity, and inclusion in business, employment, and services. Now, bearing in mind that all of this would be ambitious, even if we had 3 hours together on each of these different areas, but I thought we can at least do a little bit of a whistle-stop tour and have some material for our discussion together. Ooh, let's skip straight ahead to education. But essentially, as we look at the foundations, it's important to keep in mind the differing journeys that the two countries have had. So, in the United Kingdom, we had a whole host of legislation that predated our current Equality Act, which was introduced in 2010, that focused on specific characteristics prior to that, such as disability specifically, or what we used to call the Race Relations Act. And today we have the Equality Act 2010, and a lot of our training, our initiatives, a lot of our education policies, all of those were sort of formed from the angle of compliance. On the other hand, what I've seen more so in the United States is that a lot of the DEI structures that we currently see are often a product or offshoot of the civil rights movement. And additionally, in relation to, for example, the feminist movement, as far as the policies surrounding women, surrounding the rights of women, both in the workplace and in terms of family law, for instance. So those are two different cultural lenses that we are approaching it from. Um, Additionally, something that is quite important to keep in mind is that we're in a globalized world with widespread media coverage. So I cannot tell you the speed with which almost immediately UK coverage was occurring of the US election, or the narrative on DEI is so heavily interwoven with that in the US that we're regularly being asked if it's being undone in the UK too, when in reality, our current status as far as the law, for instance, or initiatives currently in place, is that we actually have the highest protections for flexible working, technically, that we've ever had. Additionally, a lot of that came about in the pandemic when we had a global opportunity to realize that work could be done in different ways and achieve really impressive outcomes despite different approaches. Now, what we are seeing is that the cultural side of things is more aligned than not. So many of the companies that are heavily feeding into that conversation on cutting back on investment, or rather the precursors to that, the attitudes that we see before the decisions are made, such as everyone should be in the office. Well, when they're working from home, they aren't doing anything. Suddenly, we saw in recent months, in particular in the United Kingdom, huge amounts of coverage on how employees are dialing in their pajamas, or less easy to reach by their workplaces, with the implication that they are not actually working. So, in the UK context, we have on one hand increased legal protections and strengthening in many ways of the Equality Act happening at the same time as cultural undermining of equity and inclusion itself. Um, I thought it might be helpful if we took a step back and went back to the beginning and looked at the role of education. So, when I say education, I don't necessarily just mean at university level, as we are in present company today. I also mean at the very start, so primary education. In the UK, we call it primary school, or even sometimes infant school. So, what we've observed in the UK is that there is an extreme link between early education exclusions, which is what we describe as detentions, suspensions, and expulsions. So, there is an extreme link between those early exclusions and future criminalisation. So, research in the 2010s actually found that a Black disabled child, a Black child with special educational needs, is up to 168 times, and particularly if male, is up to 168 times more likely to be excluded from education than a white child, for instance, named Jill, I believe the study showed. And that was on the basis that the primary groups that are facing exclusion from education are Black, often Afro-Caribbean boys, who have additional needs or have disabilities or are on low income. Now, all of those groups separately will also be facing higher levels of exclusion from the education system. And this is a problem throughout the lifetime because, for one, less likely excluded children are less likely to achieve bare minimum qualifications, even if their prior exclusions were not permanent, at the age of 16. So in the UK, we have a qualification called the GCSE. So this is comparable to a minimum qualification that you'll need to apply even for cleaning or service jobs. So if you want to apply to become a cleaner or be a server in a restaurant or hospitality business, you'll generally be expected to have a GCSE level pass in English or in maths, and you are 90% unlikely to if you have been excluded in the past. There is also an extreme link with criminalisation. So the school exclusions to prison pipeline it's described as. So what they've generally observed is that often minor infractions will lead to exclusions, such as vaguely described disruptive behaviour. Now, I described in my introduction how I've often run anti-discrimination clinics, and sometimes I would do community work and be part of those exclusion meetings with families and see the justifications and explanations. So we'd ask what led to the racking up of offences that led to exclusion in the education system. And often it would be uniform non-compliance, such as a shirt not being tucked in, perhaps with a child that has sensory difficulties and did not like the sensation, or disruption and not focusing in class, or speaking too much in a child that has untreated ADHD symptoms. So very often it would be minor offences being racked up, and rather than that child or family accessing support, they would access exclusion and punishment methods. And that is what we will see as early as at times, like I've worked for legal charities before, where we'd see sometimes exclusions for children as young as the age of 6. And by that I mean permanent exclusions. So what could possibly a 6-year-old have done to be permanently excluded from their education at that age? Now, as far as further along in the education system, in the UK, what's I suppose very different from the US, although it is already beginning to change, is that at the age of about 16 or so, you are expected to become specialist before you apply even to university or to vocational courses, etc. So at the age of about 16, you're generally expected to decide what you do with your future. And who is able to decide at those ages what they will do with their future? Often children who have had more access, more opportunities, who live in areas with resourcing where they are able to do so. And at this stage, it's generally you specialize in 2 or 3 subjects if you are going the academic avenue, and then you apply to university, usually in relation to those areas. Now, what we've observed in the higher education system is that even with equal entry grades, there is what is described as the Black attainment gap. And that describes Black students leaving these universities with lower degree classifications than white students despite equal entry-level grades. And various explanations have been provided, but generally the most under-investigated is racism. And I recall having worked in the student movement at the time of doing my own studies. And what we found is that many different complaints of racism were not actually being logged or fairly investigated. So quite incredible work has been done by Dr. Sarah Ahmed, who has written a book on complaints, which I had the privilege of contributing to. She consulted quite a wide number of participants in the student movement and really looked at the work that is done, that diversity work, through practical efforts, and how poorly it is often responded to and engaged with. So sometimes what we've actually found is that universities that have larger proportions of minority groups will still have really extreme and sometimes more severe Black attainment gaps despite it. And at times, particularly in a UK context, our discomfort with tackling racism, with even giving it a name, giving problems their names and addressing them, can be a real barrier to addressing the Black attainment gap, even talking about it in abstract terms, as though there are not contributors to why people with equal entry grades would leave with such a completely different experience and completely different qualifications. So that's looking specifically at the role of education. But I suppose as we look at education, it's worth us keeping in mind that education is the site of knowledge production. Many of the concepts that will later become embedded in broader society will have first been piloted, discussed, captured, investigated, and given real substantiation, legitimacy through the work done within academia. And our participation, the diversity within who is active in academia, who is able to even progress and join, become part of academia, is so important. So at the time when I was doing my prior studies, there were only 17 Black professors in the United Kingdom. And I would like to think that I am not a senior citizen just yet. So that's extremely recent. The numbers are increasing, but extremely gradually. Even at PhD level, there are very, very few Black students, for instance, in the United Kingdom. And having said that, it is important that we also look at the incredible work that students do. And the student movement has often been an opportunity for challenges to the knowledge that we are accepting as the default, to the gaps in information, and a key feature in the anti-oppression movements more generally in society. So I thought we'd briefly look at the student role in anti-oppression movements. So students have played a key role in anti-oppression movements, and at the time, these efforts may have been met with resistance, dismissal, and even contempt. So the saying, the students are on the right side of history, arises generally from a long legacy of student activism, later vindicated by history. So I myself have a lot to thank for the student movement. It's where I got a wide range of training and I was able to be part of the National Union of Students, which is the third largest lobbying body in the UK. I was on the Black Students Committee for a period of time. I was the national representative for parents and carers, and I believe I was on the Women's Committee as well. And the speakers that we had and the directions that so many of the activists that were in that space went into, often the student movement is the training ground for much of activism as we currently see it. And a really helpful case study for us to keep in mind, particularly if we are falling vulnerable to despondency, is the apartheid in South Africa. So in the 1976 Soweto uprising, high school students protested against the enforcement of Afrikaans in schools, which sparked global anti-apartheid support. Now, universities across the UK and the US and Canada and other Western countries, and it's important that we keep in mind, prior to the internet, pushed for their universities to divest from companies that engaged in business with apartheid South Africa. And their actions were quite sophisticated and wide-ranging, so ranging from letters to boycotts, protests, hunger strikes. And student activism played a major role in raising global awareness about the apartheid system in South Africa and pressuring governments and institutions to act against it. So this was quite organized and it was transatlantic in its efforts. So it's really important that we keep in mind how connected our global struggle is. And there's some takeaways on the role of students. I'd always like to cover this, particularly when I'm addressing audiences that may include students, is firstly, historical validation. Even when student activists faced resistance, oppression, or criticism in their time, their actions were generally validated by history as part of the broader fight for justice. Progress is inevitable, so while the pace of change can be frustrating and the path may be difficult and slow, the overall trajectory moves forward, and change is something that we build upon. And accountability to the future. So look at how many previously accepted injustices that we now view as shameful are viewed as common wisdom, that they should always have been seen for what they are. And your actions and principles today lay the groundwork for long-term societal change and developing more just and equitable norms. So it's about the baseline that we are beginning to set. Or at least that's what I tell myself. As I said, I've been working in the DEI space since 1 year or so after the introduction of the Equality Act. And sometimes we can all fall foul to despondency, but change is happening. So next up, we're going to look a little bit at the Equality Act. So the Equality Act formalised the 9, as we call it in the UK, protected characteristics. And many of these were additions, so they were not previously explicitly protected by the law, such as, for instance, pregnancy and maternity, or gender reassignment, so transgender people or gender non-conforming people would fall within this. So the 9 characteristics are age, sexual orientation, and age can be both older or younger. It does not categorise a specific group. Disability. And fun fact, in the UK, under the law, disability is described as effectively the barriers that a person faces substantially and in things that would otherwise be expected as day-to-day duties of their role or things that others without their condition would be able to do. And the condition needs to either have lasted 12 months or be expected to last 12 months. there is not actually a requirement for a diagnosis, for instance. It's measured more so by the extent to which it affects a person's life and how long it is likely to do so. 12 months is what is deemed long term. Having said that, even though that is the description of disability in the law and how it should be protected and enforced, there are widespread mythologies and false beliefs that are held in UK society, even by medical professionals, public officials, and such as believing it's okay to exclude a child from the education system or fire an employee for something that is actually would legally, fairly be linked to disability. So it's important to keep in mind the role of the law versus culture. Um, and pregnancy and maternity. So we do also have protection for sex, so biological sex or gender. But pregnancy and maternity is its own protected characteristic that covers the 6 months after birth as well as a protected period. Race and ethnicity would also be protected within that, and religion or belief. And some interesting case law has also been coming about around religion or belief and whether that can also extend to veganism. Or a really interesting case in recent years was around religion or belief and gender critical ideologies and whether that can be considered a strongly held belief, for instance. So quite a lot of work happens in within that nuance around what's a protected characteristic and what is not. I see a comment in the chat around curious about what an example of a permanent exclusion looks like. A permanent exclusion is essentially, as a typical example, it would be called in the US an expulsion. So in the UK, they call everything an exclusion. So a one-off detention would be described as an exclusion or a temporary exclusion. A student being suspended for a week would also be a temporary exclusion. And a permanent exclusion is when they are no longer being educated in that school. And if they have been excluded from the education system or from mainstream education, they would often be taken to alternative provision, as it's called. And sometimes quality education is delivered there, sometimes even trauma-informed practice is delivered there. But that is unfortunately often found to be the exception. And sometimes these alternative provisions, or APs as they are called, are at times likened to prison by the children that have been in them. So it's really important that we think about really actively about where do those children who are permanently excluded, where do they go? And sadly, it is extremely rare to see that there is a full reintegration into the education system or into mainstream education. So it's really important that it does not become a permanent life sentence, so to speak, for the students, especially when it's so heavily linked to disadvantage. You're 4 times more likely to be excluded if you're a child on a low income. Now, these are the protected characteristics, so legally protected characteristics in the UK. Now, there are many, many, many different forms of discrimination covered under the Equality Act. And within that, we've got direct and indirect discrimination. So, an example of direct discrimination in the UK is perhaps what's most commonly understood as discrimination. So, a helpful one sentence summary is that direct discrimination is discrimination that happens because of a characteristic. So, for instance, someone is losing their job because of their sexual orientation, and there have been comments made that have confirmed or suggested this, that a person was suddenly no longer welcome at company events, discouraged for their promotion after they came out of the closet at work, for example, because then they may be able to demonstrate that the change happened because of awareness of their protected characteristic. So that is discrimination because of. A helpful test for this is, would it have happened if that person did not have that characteristic? Now, indirect discrimination is when there is a policy or a practice or criterion. And when I say policy or practice, it doesn't just mean a written policy. It could be an informal, commonly accepted as fact way that things work in a particular department or school or employer. So, for instance, we don't hire anyone that's taken a career break that they can't explain. That may seem completely valid, or it may seem perhaps poor practice, but not necessarily illegal. However, if they have a policy of not hiring people who have taken career breaks, what does that mean for a woman who has taken 2 rounds of maternity leave? Does she then need to justify that she was on maternity leave? And if she does not get that role, does she then need to question why she did not get that role? So, indirect discrimination is a policy or a practice that may seem innocuous or potentially non discriminatory, at face value, but when you actually look at the effects of it, it has a disproportionate impact on a group. For instance, having a policy where everyone has to be in the office full time, but not having an office that is accessible for people who are wheelchair users. And then when that is raised with you, not making some amendment or considering that as part of your decision making. Then you have a policy that would not initially have appeared harmful to everyone, that will have a disproportionate and harmful impact on a particular group. So that's an example of indirect discrimination. And victimization is one that's often misunderstood because of its name. So victimizing someone or making a victim of them, that's not necessarily what it means. Victimization means essentially negative consequences arising from how someone is treated after they've raised a concern about discrimination. So if someone, let's say, raises a concern and asks why they were bypassed for a promotion for 8 years, 8 years down the line, despite having the same met the same performance targets as their colleagues, and they query whether it is connected to an underrepresented characteristic they hold. And then suddenly, after they raise that concern, they are excluded from the after work drinks. They are treated with hostility. They are referred to as a troublemaker. They could make the argument that they are being victimized because victimization means adverse treatment in connection with having raised a concern about discrimination or raised a protected act. It could be about sexual harassment, it could be about racism, it could be about disability discrimination. And even if the original concern, let's say, was not upheld, if someone is treated differently and poorly because they raised that concern, that is itself an area that they are legally protected on in the UK. And the adverse treatment could even be a cold shoulder. It could be exclusion. It could be social exclusion. It could be absolutely everyone in your team getting an acknowledgement on LinkedIn and then people querying why you were left out. So it could be what often appears to be bullying, perhaps. And harassment. So again, and perhaps the icon that I've used is not helpful in this context. So harassment isn't necessarily used under the Equality Act in the way that it is in criminal context of someone being perhaps abusive and harassing. It can cover, for instance, sexual harassment. However, harassment means unwarranted an unwelcome conduct that creates a hostile, intimidating environment for a person. So hostility, intimidation, humiliation, something that conduct that has had the intention or the effect of that. So quite interestingly, there is again a widespread social belief, this mythology around how something is only illegal if there is motivation, but there is no requirement for motivation, in fact. Um, Effect is something that the UK equality law does look at. Impact is something that is even legally recognised. So, for instance, if someone is able to demonstrate a pattern of conduct that was creating an unwelcome and hostile and an intimidating environment. So an example that I see quite often is someone maybe asked for an adjustment in relation to their disability. They asked for additional time to do a task, or they asked for an adaptation in volume of work, and then being referred to as a slacker or suddenly trusted with less responsibility, being made to feel unwelcome in that environment and able to prove it as well. That can sometimes be not only discrimination, but also harassment in connection with a characteristic. Being told that they'd be better fit for a role with less tasks, a role with less responsibilities, things that would be considered undermining it, for instance, may actually also be meeting the threshold of harassment. Now, these are all sensitive to the detail of the circumstances, but I'm giving you these examples to show you that there are often cultural misconceptions that the law will be less progressive than our society, when often I have to remind people as a consultant and as a trainer and previously as a campaigner that many of the things that we'll accept as normal everyday injustices, the things that we've normalized and we think, oh, surely that will perhaps be a moral wrong but not a legal wrong, are in fact often breaching the Equality Act. They are often everyday illegal acts that are occurring around us. Now, I won't, in the interest of time, I won't go through every single characteristic and every single form of discrimination. But I will leave you with a link in the chat, which is that in the UK, every single employment law case after 2017 was published online, assuming it didn't settle out of court or get withdrawn. They're all published online, and you're able to actually look at different cases and what occurred. So I often assign that as homework as part of my trainings. So if interested, I can share in the chat as well. And I strongly encourage that you search for the different characteristics and the discrimination within them, and then have a look at some of the US cases and how cases may be handled similarly or differently. You may notice that I've got on this screen discrimination arising from disability, duty to make reasonable adjustments, and failure to comply with the reasonable adjustments. Now, all of those are disability related. Um, I see a comment in the chat. So I mentioned earlier that DEI laws were the most protected now than ever. What do I think about the contrast between UK laws and the defunding of DEI in America? Really interesting question. So I would say that it appears as though change in America, legislative change, happens one on a very atomized state-based level, which is really difficult to keep track of in an organized way, particularly considering the size of the USA. And two, change seems a lot quicker on a legislative context in the USA. So we've been pushing for certain changes or amendments or additions to the Equality Act, even just the guidance surrounding the Equality Act for years. And it does generally take, for example, some of the changes that we were seeing implemented in 2024 and 2025 around enhanced sexual harassment protection. So, for the first time in a long time, previously this protection did exist and then it was taken away and now it's coming back. We have now protection for employees from third-party sexual harassment. So the employer will have responsibility for if someone is harassed by a third party while they're performing duties in their employment. That could be a donor, that could be a customer, you name it. Um, those protections are coming about now at the same time as there are conversations around global companies cutting back on jobs, etc., or references to the culture wars and wokeness. That is still regular features in our political discussions, or the UK had the worst racist riots in decades just this last August. And by Black History Month in October, no one was talking about it. We were all like, and when I say we, I mean myself included, we were all frightened about traveling, texting our aunties and our relatives to please stay home. And that was just August 2024, and we don't even talk about it. So the contrast between UK laws and America, I'd say change happens a little bit slower on a lobbying and policy change front, and that's somewhat protected us from the swings of political will. But that doesn't mean it's completely a million miles off of what's happening in America. We are still dealing with the rise of a global and extreme right. We are dealing with a rise in racist sentiment, discriminatory sentiment, threats to autonomy, and often having to make some of the same arguments that we were making decades ago. So culturally, the UK is facing a real challenge between culture and the law, and often we do have to test the law and exercise it and practice it. So strategic litigation has a big role in protections of UK equality. Whereas in the US, progress can be undone so quickly. It's really pushing a boulder up a hill. It's difficult to answer that question in one go, so I really hope I've addressed at least some of it. I'd say that the law is at times a blunt instrument when you're up against culture. I see that there is a raised hand. What I'm thinking is, just in the interest of time, we can perhaps put the questions in the chat, and we will open the floor for interactive questions in just a few minutes, in fact. So I will close off the legislative section and the business and services section. Now, I thought it might be helpful for us to cover off the social model of disability, because as you can see in the previous slide, quite a few of the grounds within the Equality Act on discrimination relate to disability. So the duty to make reasonable adjustments, that's things such as you have a student who is visually impaired, who cannot see. Provision of braille materials, provision of alternative assistive technology, for instance, those would be reasonable adjustments. And non-compliance with reasonable adjustments is a really, really common thing. Sometimes reasonable adjustments can be as simple as Someone may have short working memory in connection with neurodiversity, or a person who is autistic may need for there to be written action points after their one-to-ones with their dissertation supervisor or their employer in the workplace. So, accessing notes or a detailed agenda before a meeting can be considered an adjustment that is legally an entitlement of a disabled person. But additionally, if someone is forced out of an environment in connection with their disability, if they face microaggressions like being told that they are too much of a hassle or implications that they are a burden in relation to their disability, that could be disability related harassment, and it could be discrimination arising from disability, which is a whole other grounds of the Equality Act. So someone with a disability discrimination case could actually make multiple grounds on which they are challenging it. But that isn't really well understood, unfortunately. Now, I thought it would be helpful to cover the social model of disability because this is applicable across different contexts. So, how we widely think about disability in society, including sometimes in the Equality Act, is that disability is a product of a person's condition. But in reality, someone is disabled more so by their inability to access the environment. So it's not the fact that they need a wheelchair that's the problem, it's the fact that there aren't ramps or lifts. Um, it's not necessarily that they need, for instance, assistive technology, captions, braille. It's the fact that these are not shared as a default. Um, it's not that they cannot work, it's that there are poor job prospects and discrimination in the workplace. So that framing is quite helpful because if we look at the Equality Act in the UK, although it's not perfect, it was actually at least somewhat informed by the social model of disability because it doesn't actually require a diagnosis. It doesn't require that a person has got, for instance, someone's not only protected for having their arthritis and needing an adapted chair at work. When they get the label of arthritis, they're protected for those 5, 6 years that they were experiencing debilitating joint pain and that they needed those adaptations. So I thought it might be helpful to mention the social context of the social model of disability. Now, in terms of DEI in practice, so the Equality Act in the UK doesn't just relate to employees or to students, it also relates to businesses. So, for instance, when you go into a store, if you face hate speech from someone in the shop, if you are not served, if you are completely bypassed altogether, you are also entitled to protections of the Equality Act when accessing services or trades in the UK. And I will need to discuss with my colleagues what the state is in that regard in the US. And in terms of employment, so protection from discrimination in the UK is a day one right. So in other areas of protection as employees, that isn't necessarily the case. So in the UK, someone is only protected from unfair dismissal after they've worked somewhere for 2 years. So you could be fired for a completely illegitimate reason 1 year and 6 months down the line, and you won't be protected. However, if it was in connection with discrimination, if it was in connection with a protected characteristic, that is actually a day one protection. And when I talked about the Equality Act and more generally, like some rights connected with equality strengthening, I also meant in terms of flexible working. So that used to be something you could only request 6 months down the line of employment. Now, that's going to be a day one right. So we are having positive and progressive changes happening at the same time as we are having a widespread, and when I say widespread, I also mean in public services, in non-profits, even in some organizations that lead on activism to return to the office. At the same time as we finally have these breakthroughs on flexible working policies, as though that will not impact disabled people, people with caring responsibilities, people who are commuting further into town because perhaps they are living in areas that are more cost effective. Um, so, on one hand, while we do have quite robust protections in the UK, that is often undermined by culture, by the day-to-day policy with a small p, the things that may not be written but are accepted as normal. And additionally, in the UK, we could have all the legal structures in the world, but we do have a fundamentally less litigious culture than the US. The sue you culture is certainly more present in the US because there is a bit more, one, cultural normalization and access to justice. So, no win, no fee or contingency based legal representation is not uncommon in the US. That is far more uncommon in the UK. Additionally, it's often not worthwhile for people to challenge things and really put the Equality Act into practice because even when you do, you get pennies. So I used to do quite a lot of pro bono support and sometimes paid support as well of people facing discrimination. Now I focus a bit more of my energy on working with companies to prevent it. But what we generally found was often people end up settling. Cases get withdrawn due to the stress that people are facing. The legal system is inaccessible to people representing themselves, and there is an access to justice crisis. And here's an example of everyday injustice. So there will be a lift that is out of service in we've got less than 10% of the stations in London, in the main city where I live, will be truly accessible. And of those accessible ones, the lifts, the ramps, etc., will regularly be non-functional. And also keep in mind how globalized this all is, how connected it is, that we are a 24/7 society and borders don't also mean as much. So, pro Donald Trump graffiti was placed alongside abuse designed to attack residents of a family building in public housing. So this is actually in the town that I grew up in, and I only saw it the other day. And it was popping up in different places in areas primarily occupied by ethnic minorities and people in public housing as well. So that was just over the last couple of weeks or so since the inauguration. And this can happen with absolutely any political persuasion, but it's happening in a small town in South London in the UK, thousands of miles away. So don't think that anything happens in isolation. And think as well about the emotional tax. So I've talked a lot about the law, but the heightened experience of being treated differently to your peers, being on guard to protect against bias and adverse effects on employee or student well-being, health, and productivity is research that actually came out of the US, and yet I regularly cite it in the UK. So these are the three portions of the emotional tax, or what happens when people are in chronically psychologically unsafe environments, even if it's the previous environments they're thinking about, even if it's what happened to them in the education system or in previous employers or in their university period. The emotional tax that is being carried around by underrepresented groups is what we're up against as well. And that's a barrier to accessing talents, but it's also a barrier to really undoing the damage that we regularly reinforce in workplaces, in businesses, and in education as well. So I want us to keep in mind not just law, but also culture. So I regularly say this, and anyone who's been to one of my talks before will be annoyed by it, but the law is a baseline, it is not an aspiration. And that's more important than ever when you're seeing laws being undone. Then that's when you really see people's values, companies' values, institutions' values, because then it really is about culture rather than compulsion. But having said that, the baseline is so regularly bypassed. Now, I've been talking for a while and I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to hand right back over to my colleague and open up the floor for questions.
First of all, we want to just say thank you so much. Audience, let's give her a virtual round of applause. So insightful. This is information that many of us would not have been privy to. There are students online, a lot of my students, students across the university. This is a nice number for a webinar. There's the Dean of Arts and Sciences and other administrators, Bethany Bolins here, my colleague, Dr. Kimberly Code. So there's, I see Patrina, I see one of my students, Patrina, different ones. And so we are blessed to be able to get a cross-cultural perspective on this. And I just wanted to thank you just for the brilliant analysis and just, we need thinkers and we need thought leaders in our world today. I will, and I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Jackson, but I was so struck by the support way out in that small country town in London for our president. And so I'm going to be quiet, and I'll save my comments to the very end. It'll just be like a minute or so. Dr. Jackson, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let's talk for about 10, 12 minutes, maybe 15, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Will do. Again, I want to congratulate. I'll call her Dr. Moreau. So thank you for that great presentation. So I have a number of questions, but I'm just going to stick to three because we have limited time. The first one has to do with in the United States, we're celebrating Black History Month here in the United States. Can you talk about a comparison celebration in UK because people might not be familiar with the celebration in UK. Can you talk about that celebration in UK in a similar vein?
Thank you so much. I appreciate you calling me Dr. Moreau. So we do have Black History Month in October of every year. However, it is still sadly not covered widely. At most, it may perhaps be a billboard somewhere, and to this day, it is not compulsory in the education system. In fact, covering race became particularly contentious in, I'd say, the 2020s. We were getting a lot of including black politicians, stating that it's critical race theory that it shouldn't be covered. So that also places barriers on, okay, well, how do we discuss the past without infusing at least some element of a critical lens? So we do have Black History Month, but everything can be neutered.
So why October?
Why October? That's an excellent question. I don't
Yeah.
actually have the answer to that, so I'll need to come back to you.
What's that?
I don't have an answer as to why October in
Oh,
particular, as
okay.
to whether it has significance.
I mean, I know why in Black History Month and February in the United States. I just wasn't familiar with the UK perspective. So here's another question. So, can you talk about some particular initiatives you're working on now in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space?
Absolutely. So, what I've generally found is that there is often more infrastructure around like more protections around particular protected characteristics, not because they're facing more marginalization than others, but often because the law is strengthened through case law. So, sometimes the areas where you'll find the most protections will be the ones that the trade unions progress legal cases on, sometimes decades ago. So, for instance, protections for the ethnicity pay gap. Because right now we've got a lot of legal structures around the gender pay gap. We don't have that for the ethnicity pay gap. We don't have that for the disability pay gap. So expanding pay gap protections is a big one. Um, Another is trying to undo the social damage being done to flexible working because that heavily impacts women's participation in the workforce and disability participation in the workforce. And a personal initiative that I'm working on is trying to support people to be able to access justice, able to litigate, and to have that support regardless of which characteristic they have. So I'm working on that anti-discrimination resourcing piece for the communities.
Thank you. And this is my last question, Dr. Moreau. This is my hope and inspiration question. What advice would you give educators, teachers, or even administrators to help them be more equitable in the classroom and create more inclusive schools and environments? What would you suggest?
Excellent question. I would say question your own perceptions, including we are all human beings. Question your own likes and dislikes. Who is really grating on you? Because the most difficult person in the room should also be protected. And very often it will be those personal perceptions that are the avenue for bias to really take hold. I would also say something to really look at is question disruption. So, what we describe as disruptive behavior, the main reason for children being excluded in the UK, is often so vague and very often cries for help or signs of lack of support. And very often you need to really be proactive and tease that out of people, the support that they need and what you can do for them. So expand your horizons, inform yourself, and make sure that your response to challenge is support and not punishment.
But thank you so much again for your responses here and your great presentation. I'm going to hand this back over to Dr. Chow so he can open it up to, unless he has questions,
Yeah,
open up to
what
the
I'll do,
other
what I
folks.
want to say to the audience is throw your questions in there really quickly. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and that'll give you the time if you had questions or comments. Because we're not going to hold you much longer, because I don't believe in long meetings that don't necessarily need to be long. So, but I'm going to ask a couple of questions. So I want to say to the audience, if you have anything else, this is your time to throw questions or comments. Well, let me just say, I think Katrina had said something that I that stood out to me before I asked my question. She said, "At least October is not the shortest month in the year for Black History Month like it is in the United States. Touche. Hey, yes, yes.
I hear that.
Okay, here's a question. Speaking of Black History Month, it's related to what Dr. Jackson asked. It's Black History Month here in the U.S. What are specific challenges Black people have in the UK? You started to talk about this. Black people have in the UK, perhaps related to either education, either law, employment, or outright discrimination. Can you say more about some of the because uh, um, I think I'm permitted to say this. So, just you may not know, Dr. Moreau identifies as a black woman. So can I say that? Is that okay to say that? I know because I asked her, and I'm saying this. So what are things that you guys might discriminate? I mean, that might experience as an African American woman. Can you talk about that in UK because we need that solidarity.
Absolutely. I'd say I identify as a black woman. I'm also perceived as a black woman, and the trolls will remind me regularly. So, in a UK context, a major challenge that we face is, in fact, that racism is a dirty word. Race itself was for a long time a taboo word. Like, we don't see color was, for much of my upbringing in the UK, seen as a progressive statement. We don't see color, or that cannot. So, very often, the response to even raising the question of whether even institutional or indirect embedded unconscious bias racism is a factor in the structures even of the setting, let alone interpersonal behavior, receives a response of how dare you, not here, not us. And that's a real barrier to, it's an obstacle to discussion, it's an obstacle to progress, and it's an obstacle to change. And it's an obstacle to listening. I mean, you have obstacles to listening, it's obstacles to learning and to adaptation. So, very often, when people have the greatest opportunity to fix mistakes or to receive feedback to improve their services, whether that is education service or employment service or services to the public, um, before things escalate into disputes, those are missed opportunities because there's far too much discomfort. And in terms of the barriers that we are facing in the workplace, for instance, race is sadly one of the areas of discrimination that has the lowest prospects of success.
Hmm.
And that's because so much of racism that we face, and I'm quoting someone else when I say this, some of what we face with racism is phantom. And by that, I don't mean it doesn't exist. By that, I mean it's the job opportunities you miss.
Hmm.
It's the things that are explained away through other avenues, and it often won't be given a name at any point. So you might not necessarily get that slur in front of you. I myself have faced racism and had to give only had vindication when I actually spoke with a white person who confirmed, oh yeah, that person that's constantly undermining you. He's always been awkward around black people and he talks about eugenics when he drinks too much.
Oh my God.
So only then do you get confirmation as to that cold shoulder you experience, that interruptions in meetings where you find out where it really came from. So racism is difficult to litigate and it needs more protection, more support.
Well,
Um,
related to that, I really didn't know that racism was profound in the UK until two instances. When I saw can you speak on what Meghan Markle went through in terms of their reaction? What does that say about UK culture? And then when I went myself and experienced racism, it surprised me because I didn't expect it. But can you speak to the Meghan Markle piece? That's when I really kind of came privy to some of the racism that's in UK that's similar to what we experienced. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, in a UK context, Meghan Markle wouldn't actually be considered black. So, the UK is perhaps unique from the US in that we have mixed races and identity in the UK. So,
Okay.
if someone is biracial in the UK, they will be seen as associated with blackness if they're biracial, black and white, or black and something else. But mixed races and identity in the UK. And Meghan Markle, even within that context, she would not visibly automatically be perceived as a black woman. But even with that in mind, because she came close or ended up joining our most heralded organization, the elite of elites, the aristocracy, which is so alive
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
strong in the UK,
Mhm.
that suddenly brought it out in people you wouldn't even expect it in. So I vividly recall having a discussion with a nursery founder in a local and diverse area who's always known for being so progressive, saying, it's okay. He will never be king. She will never come close. So everyone had such polarized perceptions of Meghan Markle, even when they otherwise had no interest in the detail of aristocracy's lives. It's because she got so close to the whitest institution in the UK, because that is what aristocracy is, the whitest institution in the UK. She is seen
Whoa.
as sullying it.
To hear a British person say these things, I'm like, oh, I'm not used to this. Uh, here's a question for Dr. Jackson. Um, is this is from an NKU alum, a psychology major. Um, is Black History Month intentionally, was it chosen to as intentionally the shortest month? I think that's what the question is saying. Um,
No,
go ahead.
well, Black History, the quick history of Black History Month is that Carter G. Woodson, the father of Black History Month, decided um, there was no way of celebrating the accomplishments of African Americans. So in the 1920s, he decided to create Black History Week to celebrate the birthdays of Frederick Douglass and um, Abraham Lincoln. And so the concept was that February wasn't chosen because it was the shortest month. It's because of Carter G. Woodson's perception of
That's
those two particular people being important in the history of the culture and experience of African Americans. So it wasn't a slight on, let's pick the shortest month. It's just his perception of what he wanted to do. And it's a long history of people not understanding the history of Carter G. Woodson. And,
yeah.
and if you have a chance, read one of his most powerful books,
Hmm.
The Miseducation of the Negro, which he outlines education policies and practices from its origins of not understanding the power of people of color and being miseducated in public and private schools.
Amazing. What a good segue to the next question from Amanda Haney. I should be saying names anyway. The last one was from Simone. But this one's from how can educators um, make people of diverse backgrounds feel more included in the classroom? It's kind of a practical. What do you think about that? What are things educators can do to make it more inclusive classroom as it relates to race?
Excellent question. So, one, it's easier if all the educators are not white because that makes a big difference. And regardless of who the educator is, little things such as making sure that you get the pronunciation of your students' names correct. You
Mm.
don't need to get it correct the first time, but asking people how to pronounce their names, making sure that you don't just leave their names to the last name you call on from the register because you're nervous about how to pronounce it. That sort of thing really stays with people through life. And also looking at the examples that you're giving, like when you cover history, are you only covering UK history? Like I remember teachers saying the only way we can cover other countries is to do British Empire in Africa or British Empire in Asia. So think about things like that. And diversifying the curriculum is something anyone can do at any age of the students you're working with.
Thank you. This is wow. This is kind of getting emotional. One student said from NKU, "This is the first time I've ever had black teachers in college as a period." You know, she's this. I know this particular student, and she's a very bright young lady in college. She has first time she had black professors or black teachers in general. Somebody else said I was raised that we don't see color as well. I only recently understood how that hinders real conversation and maintains. I think they want to say the status quo. Anybody want to comment on that? This color blindness is very. It's a noble. Let me read the rest of it here. Maintains the racial inequality through a college. They learn through a college course. Um, then the woman says, or the person says, I learned so late in life. So speak on that. Color blindness sounds very noble, but what are the problems around, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. Can you speak on that, Sophia? And then you can weigh in too, Dr. Jackson, if you want.
So colorblind is one of those like statements that at surface level sounds innocuous. And that's why sometimes people who challenge it are received so poorly. But it places the problem not on racism, but on the person's race. So it again outsources it and it makes talking about it taboo. And it also just makes the person who is treated as the default, the white person, more comfortable. It kind of also reinforces that whiteness is the default. It doesn't have a color. And we need to just not talk about differences. The differences are the real problem.
Yeah,
Happy to hand it over to Dr. Eric.
that's great. Dr. Jackson, you want to weigh in on that at all?
No, not particularly. I mean, that was eloquent. I mean, that's nothing I can add. I mean, it just makes people feel comfortable using the term. I don't see color. And they don't have to interrogate why that concept makes them feel comfortable of not seeing color. Whereas my wife and I usually have the joke is unless you're legally blind, you see color. The question is, when you see color, what does that mean?
Mm,
When
mm.
you see different ethnic groups, what does that mean? Because you see people's skin tone unless you're legally blind.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. This is a question from Dr. Kinsey Bryant Lees, associate professor in the Department of Psychological Sciences. That's why I love this conversation. We got such a diverse group. My question is how can educators, organizations ensure that they're asking the right questions, either through surveys. This is a research question, either through surveys or data collection methodologies to understand what the organization, whether an organization is inclusive or equitable. How can they ensure we're asking the right questions, research, collect the right data to ensure that we're equitable? Sometimes it does seem like we miss it. Does that make sense?
Does make sense. So firstly, taking the data in the first place, because sometimes that's half the battle, getting a willingness institutionally to take the data and to take it regularly enough that you can see changes. So I would say the questions being clear enough in what they're asking. So I do quite a lot of auditing and questionnaire setup. And what I found is that if I ask people if they're disabled, very few people will say yes because it's such a societally contentious thing. Identifying as disabled, people will think of someone who is a wheelchair user and a full-time wheelchair user or paraplegic, for instance. They will not necessarily know what the legal definition is or what the other working definitions are. So instead, asking questions based on the legal definition and seeing the gap between how many people identified as disabled versus how many people ended up meeting the criteria of disability in a company. And that can sometimes lead to investment in training and in initiatives and in support for that population, which you wouldn't have gotten if you just relied on the usual census questions. So being really inquisitive and seeking the information rather than seeking to tick a box will get really far. And making sure you have something experience based in there just so that you find out even little things like not just whether you have these populations there, but whether they're overrepresented in your complaints, whether they are overrepresented in having a different satisfaction levels. That can tell you so much.
Yeah, and I want to say, let me just say this before I forget. We do have some great questions. There's a lot of positive feedback. Dr. Moreau, somebody says thank you for sharing. Dina says thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge and understanding. I am better today because of you, and I
Oh,
think
thank
that's
you so much.
important. I got an email from my colleague Dr. Sulu, and he thanked you for speaking and just doing a wonderful job. So we're getting a lot of good comments. Let me do a couple more questions here.
Let me jump in this data collection real quick before
Yeah,
you
oh, please
next to
do,
the next
please
one.
do.
So my general fallback position for data collection is always starting at your end result. Like, why are you collecting data? And what are you going to do with the data?
Yeah.
Because just collecting data for the sake of collecting data is not really productive,
Mm.
because people get surveyed out after a while when they don't see the data is changing the culture or whatever the end result is. So I would start with the question of what is the end result of collecting data? What is your objective after you collect the data? What are you trying to do with the data?
Yeah. To Sophia Moreau and Dr. Jackson, somebody asked, I just want to know when the podcast is going to drop. Hey, this is good stuff. Somebody asked, is there a shortage? Oh, this is a good question. I really like this. There a shortage of black male teachers in the UK like there is in the United States? And why or why not?
Yes, there is, and it's terrible. There is the short answer. And I think the only way that that will possibly be overcome is if you look at what's happening earlier in the education process. The primary people targeted for exclusions when a white child would have access support are Black men in particular, Black boys at that stage, in fact, particularly Afro-Caribbean Black boys. So it's really important that we look at education equity throughout the education cycle because you'll have a hard time qualifying as a teacher if you've had disruption in your educational trajectory. Um, and also funded support because teachers in the UK are paid so much worse than in the US,
Oh,
so much worse.
whoa.
So a teacher who's had to go through a lot of training and qualification specifically for qualified teacher status will get about, until recently, about 22 grand. And if you're a teaching assistant while you're waiting to qualify, sometimes it will be 15 to 20. So it's very, very, very low pay, and people will often leave. So it's not attracting a whole lot of people.
Wow. The questions are really coming in. And I apologize if I miss um, some of your questions. I'll do a couple more, then we'll wrap up. I'll give you your time, give you the gift of time. This question has to do with, well, somebody said, thank you for sharing your knowledge so late and offering us, because it's late for you there, and offering us a transatlantic perspective. A student asked, Becca asked, how do we as students work to educate our peers? Oh my gosh, this is such a good question, Becca. How do we as students work to educate our peers who are unwilling to recognize inequalities that are occurring in our society?
Excellent question. In the interest of time, I'll start with something practical you can do. So if it happens in the form of jokes, not laughing is a really powerful thing. Because if someone is saying a provocative joke, particularly at the expense of a group, what they want is a reaction and attention, and showing them that it's not funny and you're not reacting is a really powerful tool. And microaggressions have micro interventions too. So how you respond to the first acts of perpetration in your presence, the first offense, the first attack on a group or punching downwards, can also change the trajectory of the conversation because it's easier for other people to jump in and say, "Yeah, actually, that wasn't appropriate. I don't know why you said that. What do you mean by that?" It's easier for people to do that when someone else has started that chain off. So be the person that does that.
There's one that I think is important. I'll give a quick answer. Somebody asked about the Greek societies. How can we combat victimization within organizations like sororities slash fraternities? And I would focus on fraternities because of this a patriarchal environment, in an environment that I'm not demonizing fraternities. I just know that at times there are males. It's a male dominated society, and I think we need more whistleblowers, to be honest. I think that the secrecy of fraternal orders, even like Masonic societies, etc., and so forth, can lend itself. If there's some dysfunctionality going on, that secrecy can lend itself to victimization. So I think people need to be brave and stand up and say, hey, we're not going to tolerate sexism. We're not going to tolerate misogyny. So yeah, that's a big question. That's a loaded question. Last one. How can educators work to better foster a more inclusive and welcome environment among students in classrooms? I think we answered that, but would you add to that? What are other ways we can create a more inclusive classroom? Maybe resources, curriculum. What do y'all think?
Excellent question. I'm conscious that we're in a room of educators as well, so you'll have far better ideas than I would. But I really, really love making sure that one, you give non-Christian holidays and global cultures like real time and attention, and encourage like the some of the most influential people will be educators in the lives of a
Mhm.
person because
Right.
that's the stuff we think back on throughout our lives. So giving that opportunity for your students to learn from each other as well and trying to make education as interactive as possible and as decolonized as possible is incredible.
Yeah, decolonize. That's such a good word. That's such a good word. Um, So let me just close out by some. I apologize for questions we didn't get a chance to. The questions really started coming in towards the end, and I thank you for this conversation. I just want to say this is part of a larger conversation. We are not a one and done organization. In the College of Education, which is my home college, and then the Arts and Sciences, we try to keep these conversations ongoing. Students are currently protesting right now, which I just found out today. There's a sit-in going on campus. They are challenging some of the DEI, the anti-DEI legislation that's going on in our country and our universities. that's targeting universities. Actually, University of Cincinnati temporarily revoked. They had a few days ago canceled their DEI efforts, but through the student protests. I saw one article. I got to do some further research just today that he retracted it and said we're going to temporarily keep the DEI efforts until further notice, which shows that we can take a stand. I know in the United States, protests really work, and anywhere, but in the United States, we've had a history of successful protests, and so we're going to keep doing that. This is a larger conversation. When Dr. Moreau, we're going to speak it into existence, as we say at church. When Dr. Moreau comes to the United States, we're going to all throw a big party. We want to pack it out. We want to really do this, continue to do this work. Her and I and others are trying to do this international work without just talking. I mean, doing some. I like Dr. Jackson talked about policy, even with enacting new policies and laws and trying to push the envelope with equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important. And so pass this on to your neighbors. Email me on I'll put my email address. I always tell people your homework is email some ways that you are applying this knowledge to your situation. Whether you are an administrator at school, whether you're a student, whether you are a business owner or you work at a business in your family, think about ways you can apply what you learn to your own life. Tweet things out. This will be available online in the very near future, and so you can listen in and pass it around. I'm going to also talk about our next event, which is coming right up. We have Christy Williams from the National Geographic. Hopefully you can all see that. Colleagues, can y'all see that? My panelists, can y'all see what I'm
Yep.
displaying? Okay, good.
Yep.
This is Christy Williams. She's another rock star like Sophia Moreau. She's from the National Geographic. This will be floating around campus. This advertisement. This is a lot in-person one. Okay, it's next Monday at 6 o'clock in MEP 200, the Math Education Psychology Building. It's free. Tell everybody. Tell your neighbor. Tell your friend. Tell your cousin. Tell your uncle. Yeah. Tell everybody to come on. But I just want to end by saying thank you, thank you, thank you. We are privileged and blessed. We all have a friend in the UK now, a brilliant friend. Thank you so much for what you do, and keep your head up. Stay in solidarity. We're with you. Thank you all, and stay in touch for next other events. We're going to sign off right now and talk to you later. Thank you, everybody. Bye.